There's nothing better than some super sexy 3D UI. You know, it just takes that stuff to a whole nother level. The 2D UI that's flat and one dimensional, right? Well, two dimensional. You take it into 3D, it's a whole new ballgame. So that's what we're going to be creating today in Blender. And before we get into Blender, we need some UI, right? And the current tool for that is Figma. So initially, dropped in the logo, playing with some typography, and just continue to flesh that out. Noodle it to your heart's content. Drop in some rounded rectangles to represent different sections. Split it up. We don't know exactly what content we want for this app, but for a brochureware website, kind of an app format for a design studio called Creator Studio, which is a real studio that I'm currently in the process of building. Stay tuned. But yeah, so in Figma, just continue to block that out. And then once you're happy with the general layout, then it's a matter of dropping in some content. So using the text tool, I continue to drop in some text elements. Right now working on the bottom nav area, just throwing in some circles as icon placeholders. And this can take some time. I've sped this up 600% so you don't have to watch it all. And then shortly here, we'll just use the magic of video editing and magically transport to a further stage in the UI development. So let's do that now. And we're back, and you can see that we've added a lot more detail into our UI at this point, and continuing to noodle some of the different elements. Wasn't sure how I want to label this kind of studio availability / capacity bar up at the top. I thought that would maybe be a novel idea. Is if you're a prospect and you come to this page, this app, this mobile site, whatever it is, and you see that bar and you can see that, oh, they're full, they must be good, high in demand, or oh, I came here just at the right time and there's a little bit of capacity available there. I better act fast, right? So just continuing to build that. And again, we will rely on the magic of video editing and go ahead and push forward. And what I'm doing at this point, now that my UI is done, is I've right-clicked on, with the entire frame selected up there at the top where it has the text above the UI, right-click and select copy as an SVG. And then I'm jumping into Illustrator. We're going to be using lots of apps here. So, you could do this straight out of Figma as well. But I feel a little bit more confident flattening everything inside of Illustrator. So that's what I chose to do. So you can see I hit Command Y to go into outline mode and kind of see where those masks are, kind of masking the shapes, which is great for the web, and that's how you would do it. But when bringing these vector SVG elements into Blender, that's not going to work. You don't want items that are masked. Now, sure, you could create booleans out of those and maybe make it work, but I want to show you that it can be super slick if you do it this way. And there's probably someone out there who does it better, and more power to you. So once you're happy with where your vector file is, you want to save that out as an SVG, export it from Illustrator, save it somewhere onto your computer, and then it's time for Blender. As promised, this is where it all comes together and the magic happens. So first, I just went ahead and took the cube and made it roughly the size of an iPhone, just so that I could have real world scale, which is always helpful for lighting and materials and all that kind of stuff. And so once I've got that thing in place, I import SVGs in Blender, bring those in and parent them to a null object. That way I'm able to rotate it into position and start to separate these different layers. Everything is its own curve layer, and it brought it all in at once, which is nice. So it keeps everything relatively in the correct position. When I first tried doing this, I was trying to build the UI inside of Blender, but then got the bright idea of like, well, what if we just pull the whole thing in from our vector application like Figma or Illustrator? That'll be so much better. But you'll see there's some artifacts in the text and in the icons where there's some holes punched through, and so that means I didn't take things far enough when flattening things. I didn't combine things into one compound shape, for example. So let's go ahead and jump out of Blender and back into Illustrator. We're going to open up that SVG file again. And then if you kind of zoom in on in outline mode, you can see where some of these shapes are overlapping each other for the text, and I'm zooming through it quick so you're not seeing it, but essentially I'm selecting each kind of block of text and using Pathfinder tools, combining those together, union, and then with the little drop down, create a compound shape and hit command. And I do that for everything to ensure that it's good. And then I'm going to go ahead and import that new SVG in. I saved it as a new file, and it came in at the same size as the other one. I might have to scale it a little bit here, but generally in a good place. And so this is where it becomes important to have it parented to a null object or an empty. And then that way I can move it into position and scale it up by just that one controller rather than dealing with each individual element. And then as you can see, I deleted all of the elements that I didn't need out of this new SVG and deleted the text elements from the original one. Now we're just kind of moving them into the same kind of 3D space together so that it is as if I did it correctly from the beginning. So obviously you can skip this step if you flattened your vectors correctly initially, but I decided to go ahead and leave that in this tutorial because, if you do run into that issue, which is very, very likely, because I've done this a few times and I still do it, then you'll know what the workaround is and that it's not necessarily something that you have to mess with in 3D. You can just jump back to your vector tool like Adobe Illustrator and more correctly flatten everything and combine things together. Now, if you wanted some live text in here, that's no problem. You could replace the text elements with, Blender's live text tool and And what's nice is this static text acts as a placeholder, so you're able to position it and scale it to the right size, which aligns with the design from Figma, because while this is important if you're the sole designer or creator, it's even more important if you're working with, a team or a client who has their UI already dialed down and they don't want you to mess it, and they're going to know if it's off by even a pixel, if the font's wrong, whatever. So again, it's important to know how to do it the right and accurate way. So that is what I'm trying to share here. And so you'll see that I continue to just kind of play with how far off these different elements are from each other. I've added thickness, and that's something I really like about Blender, is their curves have a built-in geometry tab where you can extrude it without adding special component to it. And it's late, forgetting all the terms, but in Cinema 4D, for example, you have to add something to it to extrude it. So at this point, I'm just dropping in some lighting. I found that area light works nicely coming in from a strong side angle, creates kind of some cool moody shadows that seems to be all the rage in this kind of stuff. And I'll be honest, Ducky 3D, he does a tutorial. It's different, but where he's doing 3D UI and kind of dissected what was going on in there with the shadows and different things, and so I picked that up from him. But this whole bringing vectors in from Illustrator or Figma is something that I stumbled upon by myself. And I know I'm not the first one, but hey, you found this, and hopefully it's helping you out. And this is one dude's way of doing it. So at this point, it's time to get into the shading tab and start adding different materials, different properties to each of these elements. My overall color palette for this is going to be blacks and oranges and whites and clears, and just playing with the nodes to get the right balance of translucency. And I've found that the translucent shader, and I'm obviously using it wrong, doesn't seem to get me what I want. So I'll use the transparent shader and glossy shader to get what I want. And then recently like in Redshift, I would use the curvature node, and found that here in Blender, the equivalent is the geometry node from the pointiness little node, whatever, and that gives you the same functionality. And every time I'm kind of experimenting here, sometimes if I know I want an exact material, I'll pull it in from another file. But I wanted to show you kind of my process of playing with things, the inventiveness behind it all, which is part of the fun. You can see I at one point here plugging nodes in the wrong place here. I'm plugging this ramp node directly into the transparent shader, thinking that it would give me the desired effect, when in reality I wanted to plug it into the mix shader in the factor box there. That was what I was actually looking for. And here in a moment, I believe is when I finally figure it out, or maybe not for this particular shader, I decided I didn't need the curvature. I just wanted one kind of constant translucency, if you will, for that orange plastic. You can see it's starting to take shape, starting to look cool. And don't worry, I'm not going to leave that background orange. I'm looking for kind of a translucent white color is what I want to do here. So again, I still haven't figured out the right place to plug in that ramp. I'm like, why isn't it? Oh, there it is. Plug it into the factor. Now we're getting that kind of more opaque edge, which just really helps to outline the shape and sell that material, which is totally what I was going for. And, jumping around, trying different things, I decided I didn't want to call too much attention to the bottom navigation. So rather than keeping that black, I decided to go with kind of a transparent plastic or glass in front of the translucent white. So it's kind of tricky to differentiate between the two. I'm getting some weird results here, but I continue to play with the settings, roughness, and which nodes I'm gonna include. So I had glass, but then I mixed in a transparent shader as well, and then I started to get kind of what I was looking for. And then obviously if that's going to be a lighter color, then I've got to make the text and the icons stand out somewhat, so I went with black. Now it's time to get this bad boy ready for render, right? So we got to create a camera, and you can see I've got the view set to ensure that my camera moves with the view, so that I'm able to just navigate around in 3D and see what my camera is seeing essentially. And then again, something I picked up from Ducky 3D is making these more of a long angle lens, so you don't get as much kind of perspective warping, if you will. In the image, it's more of a consistent thickness and perspective, and so that's why I did that. Continuing to dial in some of the textures, because I dropped in a background plane, and now I'm like, can we do with the lighting to add a little interest, paint with light, if you will. So dropping in a couple of point lights to create some highlights on the edges of this translucent white plastic or glass. Little tri-point light setup. Whatever works, right? This is 3D land. And then as I rendered that, I didn't like how flat everything felt with that background plane, so I decided to hide it and render it just on a transparent background. And I noticed a couple things that I wasn't liking, like I wanted to make the button white, the call to action button, and felt like I had something to work with. So brought that bad boy into Photoshop, where I then dropped in my background color. I duplicated the transparency and blurred it to give it kind of a bloom effect, but there was a lot of black in there, so in the end I think I deleted that, playing with some curves to pull out the right interest, dropping in some little points kind of in the area of where those point lights are, dropping in some overlay effect. And then just went with the drop shadow, changed the color, made it really soft. And that, my friends, is my process for creating 3D UI in Blender. I hope it helped.